On behalf of the Urban Tech Hub at Cornell Tech, I'd like to welcome you to the fourth and final event of our fall series, What's Next for Urban Tech? Over the last 3 months, we've looked at some of the big challenges facing urban tech, whether it's innovation champions competing for scarce funds with vital services in city government, or the collateral damage of ethical disasters in the private sector. And we took a deep dive into urban tech forecasting, previewing a much larger 2030 horizon scan effort that's underway here at the Hub that will be rolling out in the spring. Now, if you missed these events or you want to revisit them or share them, they're all archived online at https://urbantech.network, which we'll share in the chat window. And there's two formats of video there. There's the full length video as well as 2-minute highlight reels. I encourage you to share them, check them out, share them. I have no idea what a viral urban tech video looks like, but please give us a shot with those 2-minute videos. We'd love to see them spread far and wide. Today, we're taking on a much more urgent topic, one that hits really close to home, the future of New York City, its built environment, and the role that urban tech will play in seeing us through. We've got 3 amazing guests who are going to help us dig into this question. To lead us, we're joined by Michael Samuelian, who's the founding director of the Urban Tech Hub. Before I hand the floor over to Michael, one point of order. We're using the Zoom webinar format today. So if you have a question for the panelists, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen in order to submit that. I'll be keeping an eye on the chat room, but Q&A is the best way in order to get your questions to the front of the line. So with that, Michael, I'll hand the floor over to you.
Great, thanks, Anthony. And I want to just thank Anthony for his leadership in these events over the past fall. They've been a fantastic introduction to the issues that we're confronting with regard to urban technology and how it's kind of beginning to reboot cities in a really important way. So indulge me before we start with the panel in a couple of minutes. I'm going to share my screen and talk through very briefly urban systems and our view at Cornell Tech of what urban systems are. And then we're wrapping up our first class called on urban systems, subtitled Defending Density. So I'm going to give a little sneak preview of some of the students' work. The students all semester focused on using the tools of digital technology to help in the rebuilding and recovery efforts. And I thought it would be a great way to kind of whet our appetite and get the discussion going to share some of the very creative ideas that the students were able to come up with over the term. So urban systems, and our view of urban systems is very particular here at Cornell Tech. And we view systems in a very broad light, and it's about looking at cities through the lens of interactions. There are the hard systems that we're familiar with, roads, bridges, pipes, infrastructure, but then just as important, there are the soft systems of culture, education, real estate, economics, and of course, social equity. And that's been the lens by which we're looking at the best city, of course, as a born and bred New Yorker, New York as our model. And I always like to think of a quote like this, where we don't need to necessarily strive for perfection, as a reminder that New York is a provisional city, also in the words of Lewis Mumford. So it's always a work in progress, but it's a great model for us to begin to look at cities. And there's been a lot of talk, and hopefully if you've joined this webinar, you're a believer in cities and in density, but the fact of the matter is cities aren't going away. They're not going away in the US, they're not going away around the world, and the world is shifting dramatically in terms of urbanization, and that is a trend that's not just the past 5 or 10 years, but the past 500 years of urbanization, really particularly in the last 200 years. So we're part of a growing trend across the world of urbanization and density as a solution to some of the biggest challenges that we're facing on the planet. So how do we define a city? There are 2 basic attributes that we look at. One is density, which we're going to talk a lot about today, but the other is connectivity. And connectivity, we often think of it as physical connectivity, social connectivity, and now virtual connectivity. So our lens of the city is a system of systems and their interactions between one another, interactions between agents and participants like you and me or us on the subway. And the components of those interactions are largely around density, and that's what we traditionally think as urban environments, as dense urban environments, typically around center cities, but then also connectivity, which is just as important as density when we think about how we build our cities and how we build the connections that are so important that bring us together. And then, of course, society and culture, which is, again, the softer stuff that are anchoring for cities, that really help draw us to cities and help keep us there. And the kind of cultural aspect of cities are really, kind of the tie that binds us to a particular place. And then now the lens of resiliency. We're dealing with, incredible times today. Resiliency, we used to think of purely in terms of sustainability and climate change, but now we're thinking about public health in terms of resiliency and how we create, a resilient city in many ways. And we've all been seeing how cities have been redesigned before our eyes in the past 9 months. So we've brought a challenge to our students in urban technology here at Cornell Tech on how do you redesign a city for a pandemic. There were 4 lenses by which we looked at and 4 particular domain areas: reopening offices, shops, and restaurants, schools, and culture. This wasn't necessarily reflecting our values, but it was that the other parts of the economy to reopen were less important. But this was the first step in how we begin to look at reopening. So one project was looking at restarting the workplace. All of the students were given the challenge. They worked in teams to really think about the workplace. And what was interesting in this particular project for me was thinking about the ecosystem of working. We're all doing this particular webinar online, but we would traditionally think of office space, in office buildings, but beginning to think more broadly about a working space system of office spaces in addition to retail spaces that are open and vacant now, or home office spaces, or of course the virtual space. And while we're all familiar with the column on the left, the words that we may not have been so open to a year ago, we of tracking and testing and screening, there's an incredible plethora of digital technologies behind them, whether it's mobile apps, data dashboards, AI, cameras, computer vision, and all of that is the basis by which we're beginning to look at how urban technologies are really changing our view of workplaces, whether it's robotics and contact-free workspaces, to really beginning to think about the workplace in a different way. And this combination of, and this almost contrarian combination of social distancing with the messiness of an office and kind of creating an environment which makes people or allows people to feel safe, but also has the collaborative spaces and using the tools of technology to help make people feel safe around density. And then somewhat ironically, this project looked at the de-densification of office space. So this is a bit of a swinging pendulum where, one could argue that we had a real densification of office buildings and then a zero, or I should say, 10 or 15% occupancy of office spaces. When we recover and we come back to offices, what is that new density that we're going to be looking at? And beginning to think more smartly about how we used offices and the intention of offices for collaborations or meetings, as opposed to kind of deep work. And then even kind of borrowing from, Ritz's life of some of the ideas of sidewalk labs, deploying kind of lower levels of buildings to kind of create these more open areas for collaboration. And then finally, beginning to look at a vision for the world beyond a vaccine, and that work from home isn't going away. While we do, of course, hope that people will return to offices, it will not necessarily be at the same density as we were used to. So thinking about how we can grow and what sectors are going to grow in the economy through the tools of digital technology. A more modest project looked at opening cafes, basically both from the customer standpoint, but the business standpoint, looking at a platform for customers to explore options, but also a data-driven kind of backbone for the restaurants themselves when it comes to reopening, to kind of connect both customers with businesses using both augmented reality and computer vision, in addition to algorithms, which would help them look at kind of bringing people to their particular places to support the reopening of businesses. So this was an online app that developed to really help connect customers and small businesses with the lens of making them feel safe, an overlay of saying this, for example, a heat map of the particular restaurant, if it was crowded, if it was not crowded, using computer vision to see when a table was last cleaned, and really giving more information both to the customer and to the purveyor to kind of share the data that is now available that we never had before, both ways, both for the customer and for the restaurateur. one of the more innovative ideas came around looking closely at Cornell Tech itself and thinking about education and our traditional view of post-secondary education, the kind of Columbia campus, crowded lecture halls, people sitting in libraries working together, to the fact that most students were pushed in front of a screen to take all their learning, and really begin to think about creating a dashboard, building a campus for the digital age, which integrated all of the components that we're all getting very, very familiar with, whether it's Zoom or Slack, but really building, the screen not as a bulletin board where you kind of ping different applications, but really as a portal to another world, and using, again, AR and VR alongside a dashboard to really integrate all of the platforms at once to kind of promote socialization. I've certainly heard from my students that one of the biggest challenges of online learning is the lack of collaboration and socialization that happens just in a virtual world as opposed to a real world. And then bringing a gamification of it and really creating this virtual world where you're actually able to inhabit a school, whether you're hybrid online, whether you're there physically, but really creating a sense of rooms and connection between students, and thinking about how virtual reality can begin to enhance this online experience. And then finally, opening cultural institutions. Again, taking a lens of how particular goals of creating opportunities for collective expression for artists, building community, and then supporting artists and institutions financially as well. In this case, also using augmented reality to kind of create and connect communities within their local neighborhoods. So this is a degree of disaggregation of culture and bringing it actually to people, giving them the opportunity to kind of put art anywhere and really kind of create a whole new world of artistic expression. And then also an interactive game between connecting, art and people through their phone, and really allowing people to explore and engage neighborhoods through social media and through augmented reality. And finally, even doing things that, the artists that may be on this Zoom may be cringing, but, graffitiing a Jeff Koons or painting public space and thinking about a way of engaging a degree of participatory art in public spaces were ways of, really bringing art to people if people couldn't go to the art in particular. So sorry for going so quickly, and thank you for indulging me to share some of the students' work. I want to now stop sharing and introduce our three fantastic panelists who I'm thrilled to have join us. I think we're very fortunate to have three kind of incredible guests joining us. And looking at their resumes, I noticed, all of them have had experiences in the public sector, in the private sector, and in the not-for-profit sector. So we'll be able to speak about issues of density and city building and, frankly, recovery from multiple viewpoints. First, I'm going to introduce Rachel Hout. She's the executive director of the Transit Innovation Partnership, where she directs partnerships to modernize transit. Rachel has the added distinction of being both the city and state's first chief digital officer. Seth Pinsky's the CEO at the 92nd Street Y. He was most recently an executive vice president at RXR Realty. He has a long history of government service, being with the EDC for a decade and culminating in his role as president from 2010 to 2013. And then finally, Rit Agawala, who's the head of urban systems at Sidewalk Labs, formerly the lead of sustainability projects at Bloomberg Philanthropies, and the director of long-term planning and sustainability for the Bloomberg administration, and really I'd say the godfather of Plan YC. I'm also thrilled to announce that Rit has just joined us at the Urban Tech Hub as our first senior urban tech fellow. So he'll be working on a really exciting initiative for the spring, which there'll be more about in the coming months. I'm going to start the panel, and we're going to work hard to have an interactive discussion with each of our panelists back and forth. We're both old and new friends here, so I look forward to a rigorous debate and discussions. So first question, and it's going to go to all of you. So you've each worked in the public and private sector, and you've had different roles and recoveries. The recovery in New York, and lots of challenges that we've had from the 2008 recession to 9/11, et cetera. Can you each talk about the different roles, strengths and weaknesses of government and private enterprise with regard to urban recoveries, the different roles that each of them play, strengths and weaknesses that they bring to the table? Rachel, I'm going to start with you. You talk about your experiences and recoveries in New York before between government and private enterprise.
Sure. I'll start with COVID just because I joined government about 10 years ago, so I was not there at the time of the 2008 crash, but just speaking to the COVID pandemic at the Transit Innovation Partnership, I think what we saw, and just in case anyone's not aware, so we primarily partner with the MTA, and we've since expanded that partnership to include all of the major regional transit agencies. And they're in a moment of crisis as a result of COVID because ridership has dropped about 70% in the subways, 50% on the buses, and that's had a disastrous effect on the MTA's financial future. And we also know it's critical to New York City's economic recovery. So I could just speak a little bit to what we've seen and what we've done immediately in terms of public-private partnerships. I think in general, in New York, what you see in the public sector is, my fellow panelists are great examples of this, incredibly dedicated, talented people who have a real passion for helping their city. And we have the honor of being able to be in this position where it's very rewarding to work in local government, having worked in city and state. They're all very rewarding, but in the city, you see it day to day. You see the impact and the results of what you're doing everywhere around you, living in the city, and that's a result of the density as well. So, so you have these incredible public sector civil servant teams, and you have amazing scale and reach. On the private sector, as some of our common former and continuing leader, Mike Bloomberg, used to say, New York's the intellectual capital of the world. And so you see incredibly talented private sector teams. And many of these private sector enterprises are very eager to give back and help to make the city better, both for altruistic reasons, but also because it benefits them, their customer base, their employees, et cetera. We all benefit. So, so bringing those two things together, though, is a lot harder than it looks. I think all of us have been involved in public-private partnerships. What we've seen work, one example would be the live subway map. So this is an example of how a crisis like COVID both shows our vulnerabilities very clearly, but it also reveals what our priorities should be. And the live subway map was an idea from way before. This would be a live subway map for the MTA that reflects the real-time locations of trains, that reflects all the service changes as a result of construction, but also unplanned delays. That shows when an elevator or an escalator is down, sort of the wish list of everyone in transit. And this was built entirely pro bono by a digital firm called Work & Co that was incredibly passionate about public transit and had a pro bono program. And this was something that that every leadership of the MTA for the past few administrations has been interested in. We launched this in October after 2 years in the making. And while it wasn't conceived with a pandemic in mind, what it does is it provides an unprecedented amount of real-time information in the hands of the consumers. And I think this gets to the topic of density and defending density, in that digital is perhaps our best defense of density and our ability to make sense of it and make sense of these complex situations. So I don't want to go on too much more, but we did that. We also had a COVID-19 response challenge where we had nearly 200 companies around the world submit their technologies for consideration. 8 of those went on to do proofs of concept with 5 major regional transit agencies, including New York City Department of Transportation, New Jersey Transit, MTA, and Port Authority. And the successful ones will be moving on to pilot. So in all of those, we're seeing an opportunity to expose public transit to world-leading technologies. We're giving them a chance to try new things at relatively low risk and at no cost, essentially, and just to expand the types of technologies that they're working with. And thanks, Anthony, for putting that link in the chat. So it's just a few examples of how we've been working with the private sector and the public sector to help to navigate this crisis.
Great. Thanks, Rachel. Seth, to you. You've been on the public and private side of things around other recoveries. So what are the different roles of each of these areas?
So first of all, thank you very much for hosting this, and congratulations, Michael, on your new position, and Anthony on yours as well. But I guess that where I would start is by making a point that Rachel made, which I think is a really important one, which is that I think sometimes we don't realize how lucky we are in New York, both because of the quality of the expertise across almost any skill set or industry that you can imagine that we have here in New York, but also because of the passion that many people in the private sector feel for the city, and the willingness that many people in the private sector have, and not just the willingness, but the eagerness that they have to contribute to the improvement of the city. And we've seen this repeatedly throughout the city's history, including in connection with recovery from crises, whether it's following the financial crisis in the 1970s, or after 2001 or after 2008, time and time again, the private sector has been willing to step up in a way that I think in many other places you wouldn't see the private sector doing, and has exhibited a certain loyalty to the city that you may not see in other places. All of that being said, it is important, I think, to understand that the private sector has different motivations than the public sector. And while individuals within the private sector may, for reasons of passion or loyalty or whatever other reason there may be motivated purely by the desire to do good, companies and organizations ultimately have responsibilities to owners, shareholders, et cetera. And so it's often possible to find alignment between the private sector and the public sector, but that alignment isn't inherent in the structure of the private sector. And so there always is going to be an important role for government to play, and you need government in many ways to play the critical role and the lead role if you want both to continue to prosper in good times, but even more importantly, to turn things around in bad times. The role of government is vast, and the role that government plays in ensuring recovery is extensive. It starts from the simple, and I'm sure we'll have conversations about whether we're doing any of these things effectively right now, but it starts from the simple of just being a cheerleader and instilling confidence in people, confidence about the present as well as confidence about the future. And then it continues through providing resources, creating policies, mobilizing, et cetera. In so doing, that's really where you can get the intersection between the private sector and the public sector, because if you really want to get, especially an economy humming again, you need the buy-in of the private sector. And so collaboration is very important. One thing I'll just say, and then I'll let Rit add to this topic, but one thing that I will say that's concerning to me about the last several years in the city is that both in terms of a loud portion of the electorate, as well as from a number of our leaders, there's been a demonization of the private sector that I think does not match the reality of the private sector, which is not to say that there's nothing to critique about the private sector. There's plenty to critique about the private sector. And it's not to say that there shouldn't be checks put on the private sector. There absolutely should be checks put on the private sector. But there's a difference between those two things and blaming the private sector for everything or turning the private sector into the enemy. And the concern that I have is that at a moment like this, when we have very dramatically and quickly shifted from an era where our challenges were challenges of growth to an era where our challenges are now very clearly challenges of decline, we need the private sector. We need the private sector to hire people. We need the private sector to make investments. This moment is coming, unfortunately, at a point in time when the relationship between government and the private sector may be at its lowest in New York in many, many years. And that, I think, is something that should concern all of us.
Yeah, thanks, thanks, Seth. So Rit, reaction to what Seth just said, or talk more generally about the role of the public versus private sector in
Well,
youth recovery?
you know, as a general rule, it's always wise to agree with about 95% of everything Seth says. So I agree with 95% of everything Seth says. First of all, though, thanks, Michael. It's super exciting for me to be joining the Urban Tech Hub, and I'm really excited about working on these kinds of topics with you, with Anthony, with the students, and with the faculty at Cornell and Technion. This is great, and I'm really excited about it. So thanks for having me. Building a little bit on some of Seth's observations, and also what the great work that Rachel has done. I mean, I agree with everything Seth said about the different roles. What that really highlights to me right now is I think we are at risk of learning the wrong lessons from this pandemic. I mean, I think some of the work your students did was excellent. And some of those questions are not necessarily being asked or raised in the public sector and in the discourse that we have, right? I think the reality is that as we're about to jump into a mayoral election, the fact may be that the kind of city's next strategic direction is going to be defined by that mayoral campaign, I expect. That's very different. The last time we had something that was this catastrophic, Sandy, of course, was catastrophic. I don't think it was quite as systematically threatening as this. It was certainly the financial crisis of 2008. You had a continuation. It was not at the end of the Bloomberg term. And of course, then Mayor Bloomberg sought a third term kind of on the basis of it. But the initial reaction to it was fully under his watch, and Seth, of course, played a significant role in kind of diagnosing that one of the things we had to do was diversify the city's employment base. Not something that was totally new. It wasn't unknown in 2007, but it was really highlighted by the collapse of the financial employment in 2008. And what was remarkable was the success with which the city acted on that, including, for example, the creation of Cornell Tech and the emergence of New York City as a technology center. And so I think one of the fascinating challenges that we collectively have, and again, drawing on the rich civic community that New York has more than any city I've ever encountered. Like, I don't even think London has the kind of civic depth that we do here in New York, represented by Rachel's organization and Seth's and others, is actually figuring out what lessons do we learn from this? Because it would be, very easy, for example, that, well, building, going back to the way things were in February is job one, right? And for a little while, you actually kind of heard some of the real estate folks, some of the public sector folks talking, well, we've just got to get back to the way things were. Now I think we're realizing that working patterns are going to change. We will have been through a year-long experiment with a very different way of experiencing the city. It means a lot has to change. I do not at all think it means a decline in New York City's attractiveness, because I think still most people are going to want to stay in an urban environment as long as it's managed well. So I think one of the challenges is going to be, how do we think differently about what makes a city? Because if you go back 200 years, an awful lot of people actually worked from home, right? The storekeeper lived above the shop, right? The merchant lived, above his counting house. Like the journey to work that we assume is part of our urban experience is not something that's fixed in urban history. And so I think it's also something that we can embrace and build on.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And the one project I didn't show that my students are working on, they're looking at the 15-minute city as a lens for recovery as well, because I think it's a different view of density. That, density is not just 80-story buildings in the center of Midtown, but we could think about a different degree of density in cities like New York and of course others around the country. But you also raised a question that I have posed to our students, about the recovery that I'd like you guys to begin to opine on. For my next question, how will New York City recover? And, that's kind of, like you said, standard operating procedure. How can we recover, which is slightly aspirational, but how should we recover is really kind of the lens by which I think we should begin to look at, a post-COVID world looks like. And to that end, nearly every industry and system in New York is suffering. Tourism, small businesses, the MTA, vulnerable populations, unemployment is, 13%, or up to 30 in some areas of the city where, it's probably felt most deeply. So think a bit, you've all been in government and private world. Which industries need the most support? You talked about, diversification of sectors, industrial sectors. So Rachel, if you were kind of running the world for a minute, which industries do you think need the most kind of support and propping up, and where do we begin?
Sure. So it's obviously it's a great question. I'll also point to the Partnership for New York City's report, a call for action and collaboration that goes into a lot of different measures that could happen. And I just want to echo that I agree with Seth and Rick's comments. Looking at this again through a transit lens, any job that's in the service industry or requires, physical engagement, hospitality, restaurants, essential workers, police, medical, et cetera. Obviously that's in the private sector. So I think there's a few different ways to approach. First, if we're looking at transit jobs, it's critical to get the federal support that we need to close the operating gap. Transit has always operated at a deficit, but when you also combine that with a 70% drop in ridership, they're in a really challenging position. I would make the argument that transit is the backbone of our city and our economy, and it's that connective tissue. And even in a place where you have the 15-minute city, usually a transit hub is one of those assets that needs to be within those 15-minute range. So I'd say that's number one, is we're going to need that support. There's a lot of common sense measures that don't require digital innovation, such as mandating masks. So already the governor has made it, the law to wear a mask on public transit. That's being enforced. Studies have shown, I'll just use this opportunity to reinforce, the studies have shown that when there's universal mask usage on public transit, it is safe to take. Regardless of that being the science, there's still a lot of apprehension and a lot of concern about using that. And so we know that anyone, essential workers who need to get to their jobs, lower income New Yorkers, many New Yorkers rely on public transit to get to work, and we need it to be as safe and resilient as possible. We were on the cusp of a historic capital improvement program that is now completely in question as the MTA struggles to even meet its operating budget needs. So I'd say that's part one. I agree, everything's going to change, but that's New York. New York is constantly reinventing itself. That has been accelerated dramatically, obviously by the COVID pandemic. I'd say, it's a dire situation. I think one of the silver linings has been that we've seen accelerated digital transformation across the board. In some cases, such as in, I'd say at the MTA, in terms of some process improvement, it's been better than in, for example, education, where there's still a lot of room for improvement, a lot of challenges and a lot of need for strategic vision. We've been very proud to work with our partners at the MTA on improving that. And I'll just go back to another point, just again, looking at things with a digital lens, which is that even before COVID, at the Transit Tech Lab, which is the accelerator that we run for public transit, we saw a commonality among all of our proofs of concept that they were all in some way digitizing an analog process. And I think you could extend that digitization to citywide. And what that offers for a city that's reinventing itself in the face of COVID is the ability to have more information, the ability to make things safer and more efficient. And we can integrate these tools in all aspects, the ability to manage things remotely so that again, things are safer. And just to give a few examples, we have pilots that remotely manage the status and service of elevators and escalators. We have pilots for something called Remix that helps to digitize the bus route planning process and integrate data sources so that we know that we're serving the workplaces of essential workers and low-income New Yorkers. So the tools are all there. It's more, how do we work through the bureaucracy of the public sector to implement these tools, support a culture of continuous improvement in government, and get them out there, which is no small feat, but thankfully we have great partners.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you're there and you're doing this. It just shows where innovation can really, the kind of push-pull of government and private industry. So Seth, you were charged with economic development strategy for a long time for the city. So reflecting with the devastation we're dealing with in the economy and transit, et cetera, where would you start?
Well, so first of all, I realized that I forgot to congratulate Rit on his position as well. So congratulations to you. I also want to just make one broad comment, then I want to answer your question. The broad comment is picking up on something that Rit said about making sure that we're learning the right lessons. I think it's very important as we're evaluating the path forward, not to take too much from what's been happening during the crisis, and to try to anticipate what the world is going to look like after the crisis. Which is not to say that the world after the crisis is necessarily going to look exactly like the world before the crisis. It probably won't. But it may not be that the world that we're living in now is reflective of the world after the crisis either. And I think that we need to be a little bit patient and understand once the crisis has started to abate, what direction we're heading in before drawing broad conclusions. But to answer your specific question about recovery and where I would start, you used, in your question, you asked what industries we would focus on. And I guess the lesson that I learned working under Mayor Bloomberg, who I think believed this very strongly, was that the key to New York's recovery is not really any industry, it's about people. What I've come to believe is that what oil is to Saudi Arabia, a smart and talented workforce is to New York City. And that therefore the number one priority I think that we need to have as a city is figuring out how we retain that diverse workforce in the city. And this, by the way, was something that I was concerned about even before the pandemic because of issues like affordability and quality of life, but it's now especially going to be an issue for us. And the reason for that are several. First of all, one of the things that has glued people to New York has been the fact that this is where you can get certain jobs. And if you wanted those jobs, you had to be in New York. As Rit alluded to, if the workplace is changing and you don't necessarily have to physically be in any place to do a job, is that going to change the calculus in people's mind about the desirability of being in the city? The second, though, and I think more important point is that speaking of this calculus, when people think about living in New York, whether they're doing it consciously or not, what they're doing is they're balancing an equation that has a bunch of pluses and a bunch of minuses. And the minuses of living in New York are expenses, dirt, crime, noise, crowds, all of those things. And the pluses have tended to be the things that all of us associate as being the advantages of living in New York: great restaurants, the ability to meet diverse people, the entertainment and culture, and the list goes on. The problem that we're now facing is that many of the minuses on that list are growing. The pluses, at least today, many of them are gone. And what we need to really focus on, and what I think our government needs to focus on, is on the one hand, getting those pluses back up and running as quickly as possible. What I refer to as the magnetic infrastructure, the assets that the city has that attracts people here. And then making sure, as we're cutting budgets, which we're definitely going to have to do, that we're managing those budget cuts effectively so that the minuses don't so expand that they overwhelm the pluses. And in my opinion, if we can do that, if we can retain that diverse and talented and smart workforce, then over time, we'll be fine. The businesses will return because they're going to come here for the talent, and the talent is what drives their location decision making.
Thanks, Seth. Rit, any reactions to that? What industries or urban systems do you think need the most.
I'll build on that because I think in this one, I agree 100% with Seth. And so to build on it, I'd say it's not so much the specific industry, but I'd focus on the ground floor, right? The distinctive experience of living in a city is walking down the sidewalk and all the different things that are offered to you as you do so, whether that's the hot dog stand or the green cart, whether it's the fancy restaurant or Papaya King, whether it's a chain store, less interesting, or a unique, one of a kind retailer, right? Those are among the people who are suffering. And I wouldn't discount, Rachel's concern for the transit workers, no question. But the future of those ground floor occupants is in severe question right now. And I think much like the financial crisis of 2008, we've known that all along, right? Because whether it's DoorDash or Amazon or Netflix or whatever, right, there have been a lot of things that even in our most densely populated neighborhoods have meant people are relying less and less on those retailers. And the fundamental economics of that industry is changing. Sidewalk Labs, in fact, over the last couple of years has put out a bunch of things around the future of ground floor. And one of the implications is that landlords have to stop viewing the ground floor as an extractive site. Like, you're not going to make most of your profits on the ground floor. In fact, you should be thinking about the ground floor as something that subsidizes, or rather something that creates value for everything that's above it, because it's the ground floor experience that will lead people to want to come into the city, that will lead people to want to go to the office, or in Seth's equation, will lead people to say, whether it's Prospect Heights or the Upper West Side or Bed-Stuy or Sunnyside, wherever it is, that's also part of the experience that leads people to choose, I'm going to stay in New York, as opposed to moving to Nassau County or the Poconos or something, right? And so I do think that structurally we're going to have to, as a city, think about how do we ensure that we don't wind up with a homogenized ground floor experience. We don't wind up with sawtooth, vacancies. And also think about, you see lots of places. I lived in Palo Alto for a while, and one of the things that happened there, again, probably will stop now, but was the prices that tech companies were willing to pay for offices got so high that they were taking up retail storefronts, right? Which is not really the kind of sidewalk experience that you want, because it doesn't create the kind of vitality. It doesn't create the open atmosphere. It isn't inviting to all people. Yep. And I think we've got to be thinking about curating our ground floor experience in New York City in a way that we've never had to do before. The second thing I'll say, just to finish, the same thing is going to go for the culturals, because most of our marquee culturals have, over the last 10 years, enjoyed the profits from serving really well-off and large numbers of tourists. And while I think it's reasonable to think there's going to be a boost in tourism sometime when everybody's pent-up demand to go somewhere is unlocked, it's probably not going to stay at the same levels that it was. And figuring out how we get the culturals off that revenue stream so that they can survive in this new world is going to be similarly important to the equation that Seth proposed.
Can I also, Michael, just jump in with one other point? On Rit's point about landlords needing to look differently at retail space, again, I'm in full agreement with him on that. And I think that it's an important point to amplify and to make a little broader, which is that one of the things, and I know I keep inserting concern into the conversation, but one of the things that really concerns me about the current environment from a public policy perspective is I think that a lot of the discussion has not fully internalized how fundamentally things have changed in the last 9 months. And there are assumptions that what has worked in the past, or what the implications of certain policies have been in the past, will necessarily work or be the same implications going forward. And I don't think that's a safe assumption for us to make. And so, coming back to Rit's more specific point about the street front experience, which I agree with, I think it's not just landlords who need to think differently about the ground floor, it's also the public sector. And there are so many different ways that our government makes it difficult for small businesses to operate and to thrive in the city. And unless that changes, and unless government helps to bring down the cost of doing business and just the headaches of creating a business, then we're going to lose that essence of what makes New York special. And I want to emphasize, again, when I speak like that, I'm not talking about eliminating regulations. I'm not speaking about eliminating taxation or anything like that. But if you've owned a small business or you've worked in government, what you see is that there is so much inefficiency and so much bureaucracy and so many ways in which government makes it difficult to do what you want to do without actually accomplishing the goals that's often stated as being behind those policies, that it makes it very difficult to succeed. And so I think, for all of us, from the private sector to the public sector, we all need to realize that we're in a completely different world and we need to behave accordingly.
Yeah, I think that's a great point about, particularly the government lens of, thinking differently and acting differently to support small businesses. I mean, just to dwell a bit on what you were talking about, Rit, something close to my heart. I mean, this is all very personal, but you mentioned, Prospect Heights in a neighborhood that I live in. It's incredibly vibrant, at least during the summer or warm weather months, due to open streets and open restaurants. And it was a whole different view of the city if you go to Midtown Manhattan, which is, a monoculture. And I think that one of the lessons here as a planner or urban designer is, something that is, mom and apple pie now, but just diversity of land use and having a multiplicity of things happening, which is also, I would argue, why people move to cities. It's not just a, pure suburban environment with houses or a pure office park, but it's that kind of mix up, but it is challenging to get. And to kind of veer from my kind of plan question, since you brought it up, autonomous vehicles, curb utilization, the amount of public land, to just plug Anthony's book, Ghost Road, which you should all read if you haven't read it yet, available as of last June. That, there's the transformation of cities that's going to occur when all this free parking disappears. So just, can each of you just react to that? What do you see as the kind of transformational power of a different view of mobility? So Rachel, why don't you take that one from a transit perspective?
Sure, I'm happy to. And that's an exciting thing to think about, sort of more of a positive frame. I also just, and just to clarify on what I was trying to say before is, in addition to providing support for our essential workers, any job that requires you to do your work in person, those are the industries that I think have the immediate suffering. But we love to think about the future of the use of space, especially at the curb. We actually had a curb management challenge for the Transit Tech Lab 2 years ago. And we have several companies that are now participating in pilots and proofs of concept. Some of them include CurbFlow, Numina, which is a New York City-based company using computer vision to analyze traffic flows. AllVision is another one, and also Carmera, another New York City. And actually, both the New York City ones are Brooklyn-based, so that's pretty cool. And I bring them up because they're all part of thinking about this bold future. I think, as Rit and Seth said, there is an opportunity to be very bold now. I think we're not really seeing that to the degree that we could, but things like open streets are a step in the right direction. I see a lot of these computer vision and monitoring or sort of observation companies as the interim step to rethinking that use of space, because they provide a data-driven way of thinking about the use, how we reuse parking spots, for example. And a lot of that comes back to this idea of, if all of the cars in the city in the future are shared ownership, potentially we're moving away from private ownership of vehicles. This is all very controversial, obviously, but this is like one of the utopic views of this. And they're all autonomous, and it costs pennies on the dollar for them to be moving around. then we wouldn't need to be using our parking spaces in the same way, and that would be very inefficient. And in fact, companies like CurbFlow are calling for a marketplace, sort of market-driven approach to pricing the curb, and that could be another revenue generation tool for the city. Right now, the city takes in, it's probably higher now, it used to take in about $1 billion a year in parking and driving violations. If we have smart cars that never make mistakes, how are we going to get that $1 billion? Well, one idea is potentially monetizing the curb in that way. So I think, yes, that's interesting, but it also brings us back to another really important topic, which is congestion pricing. And if it is pennies on the dollar for a vehicle to be driving around the city, will we just end up with, a city of ghost vehicles that are running errands and moving, objects around the city, people or parcels, that creates an enormous amount of congestion and has a negative impact on the economy and on quality of life and on safety. The partnership in the past has found that a different billion, it costs $1 billion in productivity. The congestion in the city costs $1 billion in productivity. Right now, we're at nearly 10% of where our traffic was pre-COVID, but only 15% of office workers have gone back to the office. So that suggests we're seeing proportionately a huge rise in that use. So in sum, we have an incredibly exciting opportunity to rethink how streets are used. And by the way, they're subsidized, they're free for people to park in, but we know that we pay for them as New Yorkers. And anyone who spent time with the DOT knows that it's a phenomenally, intense operation there. But we need to be thinking about congestion, both for the city to be run efficiently, and then again, coming back to topics like transit, where it was passed as a way to fund critical public transit improvements that serve low-income New Yorkers and people living outside the business district, really important to the future of our city as a whole. So love that topic and interested to hear what everyone else thinks.
Yeah, Rit, I know you're into the curb, so what are your feelings on it?
Well, look, I mean, certainly the medium-term future of widespread autonomous vehicles creates huge opportunities for the city. The thing that I think we've got to wrestle with, though, is exactly how you dislodge the current uses, because that is the biggest political moment. Like, once you decide that a street is not for the free storage of vehicles, you have the room to be data driven, you have the room to use pricing, you have whatever you want to do. It's a different story. The fundamental fight, though, is around whether it is whether people have the right to park for free at the curb, right? And that is fundamentally a political question, as so many of these things are. I think once you get past that, then yes, I mean, you can imagine all sorts of interesting things that happen when, as Rachel points out, you don't need to utilize the curb for that, right? And it's actually also, I think, very interesting when you get outside of New York City's densest neighborhoods, because both in the lower density neighborhoods in the city and in the inner ring of suburbs, most issues around densification really are issues around parking, right? There are, in some cases, you've got racial undertones and other things that are certainly present, but the primary fight about adding an apartment building to a single family neighborhood or adding another couple of stories to a single story retail strip, right, is always about where the cars are going to go. And that, to my mind, has always been one of the most exciting aspects of a shift to a shared ride or ride hail system.
Yeah. Seth, I don't know if you're as much of a curb guy as Rit is, but any thoughts on autonomous vehicles and how tech can kind of help curb management?
No, not a lot. I don't have a lot to add to that, but I will. The one thing that I will say is, just from a personal perspective, I've really enjoyed watching how the city has experimented with different uses of the streets. In front of our home in Brooklyn over the summer, they closed the street, and my kids would go out every day and play. We would hook up a sprinkler and they would go running, and it created an amazing community. Rather than becoming a barrier, it became a meeting place for people, which was wonderful. And it's really so heartening to see as these restaurants are struggling to survive against this very difficult pandemic, the way that restaurants have been creative in bringing life to the curb. So as philosophically, I'm strongly supportive. I guess the only point that I would make is that a lot of this is either about trying to reduce car traffic in the city, or functionally will result in reducing car traffic in the city. And to a point that Rachel keeps bringing home, if we're going to do that successfully, then one of two things will have to happen. Either fewer people will have to be in the city, which is a bad outcome, or we're going to need to have somewhere else and some other way of moving people around, which comes back to public transit. And so if we want all of these new innovations with respect to the use of streets to be successful, we have to make sure that we have a transit system that can pick up the burden from private cars.
Yeah, I think as Anthony very articulately said in his book, it's hard to get autonomous vehicles to move 1,200 people at a time. It's another world. But I like that you brought up, so we can transition a bit between this relationship of optimization of urban systems, which is where we've been kind of, where I think people typically think about technology, but enhancing quality of life, which to your point of people have to want to live in cities as well. It's not just because you have to live in cities, but these kind of anchoring reasons, whether it's around culture or diversity. So I want to pivot a bit to equity. I feel like we can't talk in 2020 without discussing issues of equity. And in many ways, urban disasters have shined a light on our strengths and weaknesses, for good or bad. 9/11. We secured our borders. After 2008, we diversified our economy further, thanks to you in many ways, Seth. So this summer, obviously, we saw historic unrest across the country. COVID exposed a lot of deep faults in our policing system, in racial justice, and our social system. So I'm sure we've all been thinking about this in different ways, and I'm not going to pretend any of us are experts in it, but in what ways do you think New York City can do a better job to address some of the cultural, social, and economic inequities, kind of post-pandemic, and a New York that we should be aspiring to? So Rachel, I'll start with you on that.
Well, it's an incredibly important topic, and I think just the beginning of the conversation is a big part of it. Whenever I think about equity, again, from a transit perspective, when you look at, in terms of socioeconomic equity, transit is serving the lowest income New Yorkers, public transit specifically. And so making sure, and those are also often representing the jobs that are not able to be remote. They have to be in person. So I think it's really hard to consider it without looking at health and health outcomes, things like the vaccine, and making sure that we have access to that for all New Yorkers, but especially from an equity lens. I think data, can be used in many different ways, obviously, but it can be an incredible tool for equity. I would point to the work that the MTA is doing with Remix, which is a Transit Tech Lab graduate. And Remix uses publicly available data, census information, et cetera, to basically allow planners to, for example, plan a bus route or plan an e-bike route, and put a person anywhere on that map. And they will basically do, I think, a 15-minute radius in terms of movement, and look at how a person of various different demographic backgrounds would be served in that location. And so here's another example of, we have the tools to do this, but are they being used? I'm not sure that that's there. So I think part of it is the conversation. Part of it is having people in positions of power who represent the groups that we want to make sure are being served, and in decision-making capacities in all aspects of economic support, transit, health, recovery, et cetera. So I'd say that's one place to start. And I think that the tools are there. Again, they need to be protecting privacy. They need to be, abiding to the highest possible standards, but we do have ways to begin to address, some of those concerns. I think the last thing I'll say is, I think that it's, from a planning perspective, and I'm not a planner, but I've been very honored to work with a lot of planners at the city and at transit, finding a way for it to be embedded in the planning system and then be reviewed regularly without without adding to the bureaucracy that Seth was talking about, because I agree that there's at least 30 or 50%, efficiencies that we could find in terms of speeding up timelines and approvals, et cetera, without without further investments. But finding ways to build that into the planning process would be really critical. I know that the partnership's very focused on this, and I'm also, I believe, along with both Rit and Seth on the board of the RPA, is also thinking about this a lot, the Regional Plan Association. So I think it's an all hands on deck moment, and the private sector needs to be there, and government as well.
So Rit, to you, do you think tech can be a way that we can address some of these inequities?
Well, I guess the first thing I'll observe is that a lot of the system optimization actually does help with equity, right? I mean, there is if you think about urban infrastructure and urban systems, certainly the hard systems that you described, a lot of them exist. In fact, many of the soft systems exist to provide things to everybody in a city. And the reality is, if you have enough money, you can opt out of those systems. But if you don't have enough money, you can't opt out of those systems. And so whether it's the public schools or whether it's the transit system, that is an option for the 45% of New Yorkers who have a car in their household, but is a necessity for the 55% of New Yorkers who don't have a car in their household, right? Or whether it's our health infrastructure or whatever else, right? And the public housing system, for example, NYCHA, which Seth had done really important work on with RPA a couple of years ago. So I think we can't disconnect the well-functioning of the city's fundamental systems from equity, right? I think the second thing, though, that I'll observe is that technology can help in so many ways if there is the institutional desire to do it. And one of the things that, as Rachel points out, since the three of us are on the RPA, I'll cite them. One of the things that was a major component of thinking around the fourth regional plan was the extent to which a lot of our institutions here in New York need institutional change. And the events of the last year actually highlighted the fact that our policing system needs institutional change. Because on the one hand, there is no question that our streets must be safe, and there has to be some sort of enforcement mechanism that keeps them safe. Because unsafe streets is going to be the primary thing that could drive people out of New York City and actually kill the city, right? On the other hand, we also know that the system of policing really is broken and is not serving the bulk of New Yorkers in a fair and equitable way. And until, once you have the desire to change that, then you can imagine all sorts of ways in which technology could play a role, whether it's the automatic monitoring of certain things, the automatic, you could take body cams to a different level and think about how you can surveil the police and make sure that the police are abiding by the right rules or whatever the police evolve into. You can think about different ways of providing services that currently the police are providing, because a lot of the conversation has been around how do you have the NYPD no longer be the front line or the first responder for mental health issues or traffic violations or what have you. Many of those don't have 100% technology solutions, but they have ways that technology could make them much more effective. And so I think the opportunity there is very big, but it can only be realized, you can only make progress on it if there is the desire for institutional change.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And also acknowledging that a lot of work that has been done at Cornell Tech, but understanding the bias in computer vision and facial recognition, and that the tools need to be good before we deploy them as well. I think the point of how do you use the tools and ensure the tools aren't biased from the start is something that we need to be very aware of. So Seth, same question to you. You've spent obviously lots of time in the city thinking about this. What can the city do to address some of the challenges we've had over the past 6 months beyond COVID?
Well, I am definitely the Luddite on this panel. I'm very proud of myself for having figured out how to actually mute and unmute myself. And I definitely could not come up with a background like Rit has for me. So I feel like I'm not as well placed as Rachel and Rit are to discuss the role of technology in that. And to be honest, I also am concerned about some of the impacts that technology is having, and the ways in which technology actually enhances inequity rather than reduces it. But in terms of the bigger question of what we should be doing to address inequality, I come back to exactly the place where Rit started, which is he referred to them as public systems. I was going to refer to them as the public assets. You know, how is it that in a city that is incredibly expensive, people can afford to get around? Well, the answer could be you own a private car and you pay hundreds of dollars a month to park it in a garage, or the answer could be that you pay a couple of dollars a ride and you take public transportation. How is it that you can afford to live in the city if you're not a person of means? The answer is that you could pay thousands and thousands of dollars a month in rent, or you could live in public housing where your rent is matched to your ability to pay. And you go down the list, we created this amazing infrastructure of these public assets, in many cases 75, 100 years ago. And I think the biggest issue that we have, and the reason why I think so many people are struggling in the city, is that we just stopped investing in them. And I think there's probably no public asset or public system that's more important in terms of reversing the inequality that exists in the city than the public school system. And the tragedy from my perspective that is greatest of all of the many, many tragedies, save obviously for the loss of lives, but coming out of this pandemic is the impact that the pandemic is having on our school children, and our public school children in particular. And there's so many of these individuals who are disadvantaged to start with, and who are getting subpar educations in the public school system when the pandemic was not even something that people could conceive of, that now have fallen so far behind. If I were running the city, my number one, number two, and number three priority would be to invest in our public school system, to try over the long run to make the public school system work more effectively and provide a better education, not just to well-functioning families with means, but also to children who are disadvantaged in a whole variety of ways. And in the short term, to make up for this year, and ultimately it may end up being a year and a half of essentially lost education for an entire generation of 1 million school kids. And to do whatever it takes, whether it's longer school days, summer school, investments in our buildings, to catch these kids back up. Because if we don't do that, however bad our inequity was before, or inequality was before the pandemic, it's going to be far worse, and we're going to be paying the price of this for decades to come.
Yeah, I think that's very well said. And as a product of the public school system, I can say that it is, incredibly challenging. And we talk about diversity in the tech field. We talk about equity and kind of helping people climb a ladder. But if we don't teach basic math skills or English skills, much less computer science, that we're not going to get there in terms of building that kind of talent pool that you said is so key to our future. Just a reminder to the audience, we're going to start to move to questions. I see that they're kind of teeing up in the Q&A, so put them there. So kind of one last question. I'm not going to ask you the hard questions that I said I was going to ask you guys, just to kind of save some of you. But just like on a positive note, why is density important to you? How is it going to be central to the future of New York City? So just in kind of a general term, talk about on a personal level, why density matters to you, why you're even on this panel, why you continue to live in New York, but on a personal level, why is it important to you? Rachel?
Thank you. And I just want to say I really agree with what Seth just said. So in terms of density, I mean, I think we're all sort of preaching to the choir here, but I do think it comes back to people and the ideas and the collaborations, the business opportunities, the educational and cultural opportunities that result from having driven, passionate talented people in close proximity is a really key part of what makes cities so incredible. We're also able to achieve amazing things in terms of efficiency, the environmental impact, et cetera. So I think that's really key there. And digital has both the ability to be used, for good or for evil. I think in this case, coming back to this question, I think it's really important to amplify another point that I think that Seth made, which is that we are training there's a lot of talk about machine learning and artificial intelligence and how they can help to make our cities even better. But if we're training them on the current data, we risk perpetuating the inequities that exist today. And so it will be key as we reinvent the city that marginalized people, that people who are experiencing the negative impacts of inequity are leaders and helping to shape those tools and to basically, be major stakeholders in their development. So it's a bit of a excited note, but also a cautionary note that if we want to build, if we want to not repeat the mistakes of the past, we need a different framework for how we develop these tools.
Thank you. Rit?
Well, I guess if the personal answer is I like to walk. I think as much as I like trains and subways, I think given my choice, I'd always walk to wherever I'm going, and you need density to do that. And by the way, it's healthy to do that. So I think that's the simple answer.
No wonder you're a curb guy.
Yeah, exactly.
Seth, on a personal level, why is density important to you?
I feel the same way as Rit. I love walking around the city. I love to see the variety of people, the variety of architecture, retail, everything that comes with density excites me, and it's what I've always most valued, and the reason, in spite of all the minuses, I continue to live in New York and live here happily. I also think that if you look back a year ago at the challenges that we were facing, as I mentioned, many of them were the challenges of success. New York was becoming more and more expensive because demand was outstripping supply. Our infrastructure was creaking because the demand on the infrastructure was so great. And if you think about how it is that we can continue to succeed in spite and address those issues, the answer, and really the only answer, is density. Density addresses so many of the problems, both on the micro level within the city. How do you make housing more affordable? You build more of it. How do you build more of it? You do it through density, but also at the macro level. And Rachel alluded to this, but if you think of all of the many environmental challenges that humans are creating, the only solution to that is for us to live more efficiently. And the only way to, and a key ingredient in living more efficiently, is density. So I really think that if we don't focus on density, we're going to miss the answer to so many of the problems that we're confronting.
Yeah, I think that's exactly, I couldn't agree more. And we didn't really get because I want to open it up to the audience, but we didn't really get to climate change and talking about the impacts of climate change on cities and specifically New York. But you're right, our environmental footprint as urbanists and as people who live in dense urban environments is far lower than others, to put a headline on it. And we've got to do that if we're going to save the planet, to talk about an existential issue. So I'm going to hand it over to Anthony, who is going to he's going to moderate our questions from the audience. So Anthony, I'm going to kick it over to you.
Great. So I want to start with Mika Koch, who asks, the Transit Tech Lab is a great example of bringing new thinking from startups in particular to help solve complex problems. Given the intellectual resources in New York City across universities, the design and technology community, the nonprofit sector, Wall Street, and large multinationals, why haven't we seen a series of cross-disciplinary task forces approach some of our thorniest livability challenges? Keeping schools open and safe, reimagining streets and the curb, keeping restaurants and cultural institutions alive, etc. I think maybe we'd start with Rachel on that question, given that the Transit Tech Lab has been her project.
So hi, Micah, and great question. And thank you for saying that, positive things about the Transit Tech Lab. I'd say first, there are a lot of task forces, and I think we've all seen a lot of task forces. And I'd say that even these task forces are up against very strong barriers to change, some of which are bureaucratic, some of which are legislative, a lot of are just cultural. And so I'd say the question is that there's a lot of appetite for this. There are, some task forces, but it's very difficult. It's very difficult to do. It takes a lot of time, and it's. I think that you need enormous amount of persistence. We were lucky with the Transit Tech Lab to basically piggyback off of a model that had been established for fintech with the banks that the partnership had done in the past. So we didn't have to do all the trial and error of figuring out how to make this work. So I would say, there are a lot of task forces. There are a lot of fantastic examples of public-private partnerships. But the challenges are that bureaucracy is hard. Culture change is incredibly difficult, especially when you have turnover, which we see in government frequently. And there are just a lot of barriers to that happen. So I'd say a lot of them a lot of this is in place, but then even once an exciting public-private partnership is launched, for example, people move, people go to different areas, and so it's challenging to have that continuity. But we would love, we're free. Just on that note, with the Transit Tech Lab, we're frequently sharing our model with other cities around the country and around the world, and I think we're seeing a lot of examples of this, whether it's in London, Paris, LA. Where this is being increasingly used.
Could I just jump in with a couple of points on that? I think I agree with Rachel that there are lots of really good examples of public-private partnerships, and that public-private partnerships offer an avenue towards to address some of the major challenges that we face. I do think, though, that the best public-private partnerships are not public-private partnerships that rely on the altruism of the private sector, but rather public-private partnerships where there's an alignment of interest, and that there's a benefit to both parties from whatever it is that's achieved. So that's one comment I would make. Another comment I would make is that, all of that being said, I do think that there are some significant challenges that are presented by public-private partnerships. I think in my experience, I've seen that a lot of people in the private sector don't really understand how government works. And so they come in and they say, well, why don't you just do this like I do it in my company? And they don't understand that there are stakeholders, laws, regulations, et cetera, that mean that you can't do it that way. And whether that's right or wrong is a different question, but it's the reality. I also think, and I'll come back to a theme that I raised a minute ago, sorry, not a minute ago, at the beginning of this, which is that I think you see fewer public-private partnerships because the government has spent a lot of time alienating the private sector. And I think that's a real problem for us. And especially at a time when we need the private sector, it's something that we should be rethinking. And then the final thing I would say is I just want to underline what Rachel said about the difficulty that government itself has with reform. And I think that the reason for that is that there are a lot of people who are invested in the status quo who also have a lot of influence within government. And as a result of that, we end up with a government that doesn't evolve and doesn't change and doesn't improve. And it's very easy for the stakeholders who are invested in the status quo to understand what's at stake if there is change, but it's very difficult for the public to understand the improvements that would occur in their life if the status quo were to change. And so as a result of that, there's much more momentum behind those who are trying to prevent change than those who are trying to institute change.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Seth. And on some level, just to plug the Urban Tech Hub, it's how we're positioning the hub too, because you also need these kind of entities that have, kind of an institutional lens, like we're here for 100 years, like that can really bridge the kind of public and private interests at the same time and try to mediate some of those relationships, because they may not happen on their own. And at the hub, we're going to be kind of looking at how we can actually bridge that gap, particularly with the lens of urban technology.
Can I just add one point to what Seth said? Obviously, could speak about this a lot, but around the status quo issue is another core issue is there is no incentive to change anything typically when you're in government, especially if you're a long-term employee. And so I think also thinking about ways of creating incentives for that culturally would be, and financially, if it's ever possible, would be great.
Can I just chime in,
Please. Yeah.
though, because Micah's question was around task forces, and we can't actually forget that at the city level there were a bunch of task forces, and unfortunately they were ignored, and I think that led to the kind of collapse in confidence unfortunately in the de Blasio administration actually do anything. Which is why I think ultimately the mayoral campaign is going to be the forum in which a lot of those ideas that under different leadership, you would have seen task forces that might have had perceived legitimacy as balancing various interests, that it's going to get played out in the political sphere, unfortunately.
Great, thank you. All right, so moving on, we have another question from Sharon Ayalon, going back to the discussion about ground floor curation and real estate. And she notes that the flight to the outskirts in response to the pandemic may create a real estate crisis, but it may also be an opportunity to make the city more affordable. How do we take advantage of this pandemic real estate crisis to make New York City more affordable? Anybody want to take a crack at that?
Well, not wearing my former real estate developer hat. I mean, and those of us that have lived in New York, for at least 20 years have seen the ups and downs of the market, and particularly the residential market. So since I'm not a real estate investor, I could say this, but look, I think that downward pressure on rents is good. It's good if, as Rich said, it kind of forces landlords to think about the ground floor differently and kind of zero out the financial value of it. But I think, having rentals offer 3 months free really opens up opportunities for people to move to the city that didn't, felt priced out before. So the question is, can we hang on to it, or is it just a cycle that goes up and down and the city gets kind of a little bit more affordable for a couple of years and then it goes back up to, the kind of inaccessible rent levels? But look, I think on some level, like having downward pressure on residential real estate values is good in terms of attracting the talent that Seth has talked about, in terms of attracting and retaining artists, creatives, and folks that are, it would maybe stem the tide of people moving to Detroit if they could afford to live in New York again.
But I agree with that. And I think that one of the major challenges that we faced even before this was the lack of affordability in New York, and the fact that it was driving large segments of the workforce out of the city. I think, though, that I'd make two observations. One is that downward pressure on rents is probably a good thing, i.e. making New York more affordable is a good thing. However, there are two ways that can happen. One is because supply is either keeping pace with or exceeding demand, and the other is because demand is falling. And I think downward pressure on rents because demand is falling is not a good thing. That's really what we're facing right now. And we need to figure out how to restore the demand, to have people want to come back to New York, but to make sure that we're providing enough supply so that we can actually accommodate those people. The second comment that I would make is that I think what often gets lost in the discussion about affordability is that affordability is really a ratio. It's a ratio of income to cost. And the cost that most people are focused on is the cost of housing. But the income side is important as well. And I think that the observation that you made about the direction that rents are going in is an important one. because I feel like in the public discussion, we're still focusing primarily when we're talking about affordability about developing quote unquote affordable or rent subsidized housing, which address the cost side of the equation. But I think that's much less our problem today. I think our real problem is that incomes are falling, and even worse, that for certain people, there's zero income. And so I think that as important, or maybe even at this moment, more important than focusing on the rent side of the equation, we need to figure out how, especially with certain segments of the population, we can create jobs and make sure that those jobs pay decent wages.
Good point. We probably have time for one more question, Anthony.
Yeah, I want to wrap up with two sort of deceptively simple, but kind of very intriguing questions. So the first is from Marcus Belfry, and he asks, with diminished demand and those choosing flight instead of fight, should those who stuck it out, presumably those who stayed in the city during the pandemic, be rewarded? And then the second deceptively simple but provocative question, if you could get a single billboard message or image out to all urbanists, what would you say / have us know? And if you're very clever, you can answer both questions with a single response. I'll give you a moment to think about that. I think the first question I think is really intriguing because you know, it's sort of hard to understand whether that's like, you know, kind of about fairness, but I think it's something that might come up quite a bit in the spring during the primary. It's going to be a very emotional kind of issue.
I mean, I'll take a quick stab at this. I don't, you know, from a moral perspective, as somebody who did stick it out through this entire pandemic, sure. I think that, you know, those of us who did and stuck by the city deserve to be rewarded. I'm not exactly sure how we would do that or where we would find the resources with which to do that. But, you know, I think that if this city recovers, which I believe that it will, the people who stuck with the city and have continued to stick with the city are the people who will be responsible for that. In terms of a billboard, you know, I'm terrible with slogans, so I won't try to come up with a slogan to put on a billboard, but I do think that the future continues to lie with cities. But just because the future continues to lie with cities doesn't mean that any particular city is going to thrive in the future. And that it's important for us to make sure that we're not taking for granted the ability of the city to adapt and to recover. And that we have to make sure that we, again, internalize the reality of the situation and we step forward and make the changes that are necessary to make that survival occur. And that will require sacrifices on all sides. We should all be prepared to make those sacrifices because in the long run, we'll all benefit from them.
Well, I'm going to steal your slogan. You started with it, you know, talent is our oil. I mean, I think that's very well said when it comes to, you know, not just, you know, Richard Florida talking about cities, but it's the people that matter in the end, not the skyscrapers and not the bridges and not the you know, the transit systems or the rivers, but it's really the people. So how, you know, cities can continue to attract, you know, young and talented people and that will live there until their old age and, you know, have a light you know, touch on the planet. I mean, that's really the root of why, you know, cities are so important, and density in the end is going to be our salvation if we have one as a planet.
I'll chime in. I don't have a good, I think, Anthony, you're totally right. Marcus's question is highly provocative and, you know, like Seth, I was here, I don't have a second home or anything. So I've been here for the duration. Both by choice and because I had to. And I guess it's a simplistic answer, but part of it is just the experience of being in the city over the last 9 months. I actually wouldn't want to have traded it. Like the kind of connection I feel like I have now to my city and my neighborhood, even though I was born here, it feels much deeper than it was before. And so I appreciate that. Now I say that from a position of luxury, and there are people who suffered much more by staying here. And I think those people, we reward them by actually fixing the problems, like by ensuring that the New York City, that presumably anybody who stuck it out is a dedicated New Yorker, right? And so they're going to be here in 2 years and 5 years and in 10 years. And the job of actually making things better is actually the right reward for them because they have that long-term commitment. And I guess to Adrian's comment about or question about the billboard, I'd say it is really about focusing on how we make change happen, because urbanists, we do have a tendency sometimes to like to imagine, and we like to draw lines on a map of subway systems that will never get built and we can't afford, and we like to imagine streetscapes that we will never see. And what really matters, if we're going to reward those New Yorkers by making the city much better 2, 5, 10 years from now, it is actually about how do you reform the police? How do you reduce on-street parking? How do you fix transit finance issues? How do you reimagine the way the city deals with small businesses and retailers? And as Rachel and Seth point out, like, making those changes is really hard. And that's the task that urbanists have to commit to, far more than just imagining the future.
Great. Rachel, quick, give you the final statement.
Oh, this is such a hard one. And, first I would say, I do not feel like I'm in a position to opine on people who stayed or didn't. I want to acknowledge, a lot of people who left may not have left because of privilege, but because of, they had to care for someone, or they had to do what was right for their family, or they were in a dangerous situation here. So I think, although I too was here, and I would say, as Rit and Seth said, it was its own reward. I'd compare it to after September 11th being in the city, after Sandy and during Sandy being in the city. It affects you as a person. It helps to shape who you are. It gives you such a valuable perspective on the world that you couldn't get any other way. And so we benefit, but everybody benefits from their own experiences. So I think, I think what we owe is what we already do for each other as New Yorkers, is we owe it to each other and to ourselves to help make the city better than before. And I would be really cheesy about the billboard and say it could be, I love New York, or we love New York. And I think just that, coming back to that, that real affinity that we all have for our city, whether we're, born here or we adopt it, something that I think is really true about New York is that you don't it's hard to stay here. It is not an easy place to live. So you have to really work at it to be here. And so everyone who is here is committed to that, and they show it every day in their appearance. And I think we're all better for it. So that's what I'd say.
Great closing comment. Thank you all. I feel so lucky and honored and blessed to have you have joined us for the last hour and a half. I couldn't ask for a more engaging panel. I had 20 more questions. We could have gone on for 5 hours, but we're actually 3 minutes over. Sorry about that to all of you, but thank you again to our panelists. Thank you to our audience. Anthony put in the chat urbantech.network if you want to watch this, or get a 2-minute short version of it, or any of our previous events. Everyone have a happy and safe holiday. Thank you for joining us, and stay tuned for more events in the spring. Thank you all. Be well.